Okay, well, welcome on in, everyone, to our 2025 Sophomore Summit webinar. We're really excited to have you here. Spring of sophomore year is a very popular time for families to get in touch and really start engaging with us because the sort of all important junior year, all important at least as far as preparing for college admissions is concerned, is on the horizon. That's not to say that the rest of the school year isn't critically important, and we're really excited to talk to you about it today. As for some brief introductions, my name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director here at Ivy Experience. I'm also one of our main communicators. So if you email our main company email address or call our phone number, text our phone number, I'm often the one you're talking to. And I work with families a lot on making plans for SAT and ACT test prep. I'm joined by Eric Carlin, our co-founder. Eric, you want to introduce yourself and explain your role?
Yeah, sure. Eric Carlin. I'm one of the co-founders of IP Experience. Really excited. It's our 15-year anniversary as a company. Also, Jim, you were a bit modest, not mentioning that you're on the board of the National Test Prep Association too. So I'll give you that shout out there. But like I said, yeah, excited to be here. 15 years. It's amazing. We started as like a small mom and pop shop in the greater Philadelphia area. Hence our Phillies allegiance to those of you who signed on early. And now we've worked with students in more than 40 states and 20 countries, be accepted to more than 500 different universities from all over the world, which is just surreal and amazing. So it's really exciting to get to talk to everyone tonight and be also joined by none other than Alyssa Coltrane. Alyssa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, good evening, everyone. So, as Eric said, my name is Alyssa Coltrane. I am the Director of College Admissions for Ivy Experience. And what that means is primarily I work with our juniors, helping them prepare for, all stages of the college application, whether that's essays, applications, planning the college list, talking through letters of recommendation, whatever it is. So I'm here to give you a little bit of a preview of what will be coming up next year. I'm really excited to do that. So without further ado, what we want to do is, and those of you who have been to our webinars before are probably nodding because you have seen this slide before, is start off by highlighting the factors that are in your control when it comes to college, the college application process, whether or not a school chooses to admit you or not. And we have a secret six factor that we're also going to talk a little bit about as well. There are a lot of factors that are outside a student's control. Your zip code, your, your zip code, the high school you go to, the state that you live in, whether or not a particular university needs a tight end on their football team or a clarinetist for the orchestra. These things are ultimately outside of your control. So any anxiety in that, we encourage families to take that energy and direct it to these five factors, and that will be how we structure our presentation for the rest of this time. Grades and rigor, standardized tests, extracurricular activities, letters of recommendation, and essays and applications. Our final factor here is going to be the college list, shaping it thoughtfully and deliberately, because although, of course, your college list does not affect whether or not a specific school chooses to accept you or not, it does affect the number of acceptances that a student receives at the end of this process and the options they have to choose from. And we're going to start with our most important factor, and I'll hand it over to Jim for grades and rigor.
All right, so grades and rigor, and by rigor, what we mean is the sort of levels of your courses. So, for example, an AP course is at many high schools the most rigorous course you can take, or an IB course if your school offers the IB program. And so, grades and rigor have traditionally been the most important factor in college admissions. Eric likes to say sometimes they're the most and the least important factor at the same time. And that's because sometimes at the very most selective schools in the country, all of the students have absolutely outstanding grades and rigor. But generally speaking, a college is first going to look to your high school transcript to get information about who you are as a student. What courses did you take and how did you perform in them? Great grades are necessary, especially for selective college admissions. But what's interesting about the situation with grades and rigor in recent years is that we can't rely on them as we have in the past, or rather, colleges can't. If we take a look at the graph on this next slide, we'll see grade inflation. And what we have here, just so that we know what we're talking about, is the percentage of freshmen at colleges in the US who reported having at least an A minus average in high school. And we can see that that percentage was in the low 20s in 1966 when UCLA started to aggregate this data. And as of 2023, the last year for which we have complete data, that percentage was almost 86%. So I say this because this is often one of the biggest misunderstandings we have to kind of walk parents through in this process. Because parents, when you were in high school, grades meant something different. And grading, of course, is a cultural practice. What that means is that we as a society kind of decide by a bunch of collective decisions made all across the country what level of work is considered A worthy. And the level of work that was considered A worthy was just a very different thing in the 60s than it is today. It was different in the 70s and in the 80s, all the way up. And so it's important to frame the conversation this way because when we talk about college admissions and we talk about grades and rigor being the most important factor, you have to remember that it's, while critically important, not as much of a distinguishing factor as it has been in the past. What I have here is data from the common data set. You may hear us reference this more than once tonight. In fact, you certainly will. It's our favorite thing, and pretty much any professional in this space's favorite source of information on colleges and their admissions practices. Most colleges publish this data. It's a voluntary initiative, and this is available just via Google, university name common data set. You can find this kind of information on just about any college you might be interested in. So at the University of Pittsburgh, which we use as an example because many of our Pennsylvania students will apply to one of these, this is one of the two flagship state schools in Pennsylvania. We can see that 2/3 of their freshman class had over a 4.0 GPA weighted in high school. Now, bear in mind a couple things about this. Pitt uses a weighted GPA. That means students get extra credit toward their GPA for honors and AP courses. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that colleges rescale your GPA to their system in most cases. In other words, we've seen high schools that have a 7.0 GPA scale or colleges that use a 100-point GPA scale and have it just be a percentage, what the average of the grades was, right? But Pitt kind of balances it to their system out of 4.0, where honors and AP course get an extra weight. And the average GPA of a freshman at the University of Pittsburgh is over 4.0. So we say that because, again, great grades, necessary factor in college admissions, but they are not going to be what sets you apart. And it's important to remember that as we talk about how critical they are. Now, course selection is an important piece of the puzzle here. When we talk about academic rigor, we often get the question, probably the most frequent question we get from families when we talk about course selection. Is it better to get the B in the AP level class, or is it better to get the A in the high level or standard level class? And the answer to that question is it depends. Of course, it's going to be a different answer for every student. The reason we work with students one-on-one in the way we do is because we believe that there are different answers to most of these questions for every student. And so instead of talking about kind of blanket advice, to us, it's more important to talk about how you make the decision, right? And so philosophically, what you want to be doing when you're selecting courses is challenging yourself. That's a good thing. It's okay if an AP course that you're going to take is going to be your hardest course. It's even okay if it's your hardest course by far. But you need to set yourself up for success at the same time. So for example, if you push yourself to take that AP course, right? But the amount of extra time that you have to put into AP US history detracts from your ability to engage with your extracurricular activities that are important to you, detracts from your ability to keep up with your other coursework, detracts from your ability to actually sleep well at night, which is very important for your mental and physical health, that's when you want to consider dropping down a level. Now, the other thing that's important to think about is that you ought to be honest with yourself if you do feel overwhelmed by your APs early in the year. Many high schools have what we refer to as an add drop period, meaning you can drop down a level in a course and not have it reflect on your transcript that you were in one course and chose to go down a level, but instead it just looks like you were in that lower level the whole way. And ideally, you'd want to make that choice to drop down before it showed that you were first in the higher level course. The other thing we do have to mention here is that, if your number one goal in this process is admission to the most selective school possible, and you'll learn later in the process, we don't think this is a good way to think about it, but hypothetically, if all you cared about was admission to the most selective school, the most selective schools in the country are going to expect you to have taken the most challenging course load that your school has available. And that's an important thing to know, just to set your expectations for if you choose to apply to any of those schools as reaches later down the line. If you don't have course rigor that matches up with the profile of those schools, then you're going to have to keep in mind that that's just going to, increase the likelihood of a denial from those schools. So when we talk about what we can be doing now in terms of grades and academic rigor, the main thing is to finish this year as strong as you can. So start thinking now about finals and AP exams. I know some schools don't offer as many APs for sophomores, so not everyone here would even be taking AP exams, and that's totally okay. You have more years. Your school might not offer APs, and that's okay too. But for these end of year cumulative exams, it's very important to essentially make sure you're making a plan now. So it's important to study a small amount as you go. And I would say to be honest with yourself about how you've been doing all year. So if you've been getting straight A's all year, you probably have less work to do to prepare for a final than in a course where you've been struggling all year. And that's important to keep in mind. Reach out to your teachers if you need assistance. This is going to be important, just to, one, get a stronger grade, but also sometimes those teachers might be teachers who ask for recommendations if you're spending a whole lot of time with them and building a strong relationship with them. Alyssa will talk more about that later. Finally, consider forming a study group. This was my favorite way to study in high school. I've been tutoring since 8th grade. It's my favorite thing to do. This is how you end up in this profession. And so when I had to study for an honors biology final my freshman year, I just spent like 4 hours on the phone with my friend Nate, walking him through everything we had learned all year. That was my preferred way to study. So students, if you're the one who's struggling and you have a friend who's not struggling, the point is you're not necessarily imposing on them. I would much rather have studied on the phone with Nate than studied on my own. You know what I mean? And I was not the one who needed help. I was the one who was giving the help. So studying in groups and finding a friend who can kind of supplement you that way is a really valuable strategy. Finally, if we get to the point where, help from your teacher, help from your friends is not getting you to where you need to be in terms of your preparation for, any exam along the way, but especially a final exam, that's when tutoring can help. So when we work with students on academic tutoring, we're not just working on, content review and making sure that you understand it, but we like to take a teach you how to fish approach, meaning we want to make sure that you're learning the skills for success in future classes at the same time, study skills and good work habits. Often we're working with students on test taking strategies. This is especially true for AP exams, but also true for just your math class. The way your teacher grades, the way they present questions on tests, the way you're asked to reproduce your knowledge to get that grade matters, not just the underlying knowledge to get you there. If you're preparing specifically for a standardized test like an AP exam, then you have to, think about how much do I need to prepare for the format of the exam. For example, your document-based questions in AP US history, which have a very sort of rigid format that you should be following when you write them, or the content where you just need to know your facts of the American Revolution more effectively, right? And you need to be honest with yourself about how well your teacher's been preparing you for that along the way and how comfortable you feel with it. Either way, now is the time to really be thinking about this, whether you're working with a tutor or working on your
All right. And we're going to sort of riff off a few of the things that Jim mentioned earlier about course selection and use that to build on this idea of letters of recommendation. But let me start off by saying, sophomores, this is not something you have to worry about yet. This is a thing for next year, but the choices you make in course selection as you are, picking your courses for junior year will come into play here. So let's start off with why are letters of recommendation even important? They, like, as Jim will talk about a little bit later with standardized tests, they offer a sort of external barometer. But instead of a standardized test, which is a quantitative external barometer, this is your qualitative external barometer. Letters of recommendation are used by admissions officers to get a third-party insight into the students that are applying to their college. What kind of lab partner are you? Are you the kid who, yeah, maybe you have a B in AP chemistry, but it's a B that you earned by showing up every day after class and talking through material and asking if you could do test corrections? Or, is it a B from, well, you showed up and you kind of did the work and then you went home? These are important things that admissions officers take into consideration. So now that we know what this is for, the question then is who? And that connects us to that course selection component. Typically, a student is going to ask 1 to 2 teachers, typically 2, often core subject teachers for junior year. And the reason why is these are going to be the teachers who know you in a subject that is, as rigorous as a course you are going to take in college and who know you as a junior, which is the closest that an admissions officer is going to get to freshman year you who's showing up on their campus. For these people, you want to ask the teachers who will love you, who will go to bat for you, who will tell admissions officers how amazing you were to have in your class. Even if, hypothetically, it is that AP chemistry teacher who gave you a B. And it's always the AP Chem teachers. Um, and that can be, even if it means you're asking a teacher who is outside of your discipline. Someone who is applying for biology, sure, ask your bio teacher, but it is also all right to ask your English teacher as well. The third letter is going to come from your school counselor. So this is a relationship that sophomores as well as juniors can work on starting to develop. Let your counselor get to know you. Let them find out how awesome of a human you are so that when they go to write that letter to you, they can also really go to bat for you. The last component as far as who, and this is one of the common questions we get most often from families about letters of recommendation, is what about sending a third letter of recommendation from a third teacher? Some schools will give you the option to include that third instructor. In this case, what you want to avoid doing is doubling up on information. If you have 2 teachers who are going to say functionally the same things about you, you don't need a letter from each. But this can show up and be useful when it's something that otherwise wouldn't show up in the application. And I think, Jim, you had a situation like that when you were applying to college, right?
Yeah, that's right. I did use an optional third recommender, and my situation was a little unique. So my main extracurricular activity in high school was track and field, but I was a late developer physically. In other words, I was JV freshman, sophomore, and junior year, but I was a 3-season track and field athlete, right? So cross country, track and field in the winter, track and field in the spring. And so my extracurricular resume looked really lackluster because I was, doing workouts after school every day. It was the main way I spent my time outside of school. But I had, nothing to show for it in terms of accolades or accomplishments. Well, the thing is that I was a leader on the team. The coaches could rely on me for various things. Back in the day, they would let students supervise the weight room. They let me supervise the weight room. You can imagine the lawsuits that would happen in this day and age. It was a different time. And actually, by the time I graduated, they didn't let that happen anymore. So I guess I was the last student who ever supervised that weight room. Anyway, I also ran the timing system at our meets, and I was given a lot of responsibilities. Well, senior year, spring track and field, I was the captain of the team and the second highest scorer on the team. I just developed at the wrong time as far as college admissions is concerned because everything's already submitted by spring of senior year, right? And you're getting decisions. So for me, I had a track coach who was also my ninth grade history teacher who had me in the classroom and was the person giving me all this extra responsibility beyond the normal member of the track team outside of the classroom. So normally you don't ask a freshman year teacher. Normally you do not ask a sport coach. It's very rare to ask a sport coach. But for me, because my extracurricular resume was basically nothing as far as a college was concerned, without that, you could see that I was dedicated to it, but how dedicated? I mean, they didn't know if I was taking it seriously or not. All they could see was JV. So this letter was able to kind of characterize my time spent outside of the classroom in a really valuable way.
Hopefully, little Jim did not ask his teacher until the spring of junior year. So that is the final component of that. This is one of the things that it is good to be aware of as you're choosing classes as you go into junior year and start building those relationships. But you do not have to ask a teacher for a letter of recommendation. Yeah, you should ask before the end of junior year. This is because teachers are going to get recommendations from a lot of students. They may cap the number of students that they write, and many teachers will use the summer between functionally what will be your junior year and your senior year to write those letters because it is when they do not have classroom commitments, they have time that's more available. So ultimately, start building those relationships, but nothing to worry about quite yet. You can worry about the SAT and ACT instead. I'll let Jim tell you about that.
Smooth,
All right.
smooth.
Nice segue. So, the first thing I want to talk about before we kind of transition into a conversation tactically about what we do with standardized testing is the big picture. Why do colleges care, right? So, uh, tests are optional most places. Some schools require it. All schools, well, almost all schools, I should say, use it. Shout out to California State and University of California who do not. But the point of standardized testing and the main reason it's ever been used in college admissions is to predict a student's ability to succeed at that college. Colleges want to predict two things that are very important to them: your freshman year GPA, how well do they expect you to do when you show up, and then your percentage chance of graduating from that college. And often they care about graduating in X number of years. For some colleges, it might be graduation rate in 4 years, graduation rate within 6 years. And the one statistic that has the highest correlation with either of those is your standardized test score. Now, it used to be for most of our history, or most of the history of American higher education, I'll say, that your high school GPA had the highest correlation with these things. But with grade inflation comes grade compression. When more students have GPAs that are hovering around and above 4.0, there's less space between those GPAs, and that means that they're less descriptive to colleges about what they can expect from students. Standardized test scores are a more stable and reliable metric in that way. And so that's why colleges can kind of stratify students more effectively and predict their ability to succeed on campus more efficiently. I don't mean to say that your standardized test score is like, if you don't do well on the SAT, you're doomed to fail at college. That is not at all what I mean to say. Statistical correlations are done on a population level. meaning generally speaking, they tend to be accurate. They're not a perfect way to evaluate a human being. No one, even people who love standardized tests like me, think that that's the case. They are a piece of a holistic review process. And the holistic review includes those other factors like your extracurricular activities, letters of recommendation from teachers, essays, grades. So it's one data point, but it is an important data point. Another thing that standardized testing allows is for a college to compare a student with their local context. With your high school transcript travels what we call a school profile. And the school profile will include various information about your high school and students from your high school. So it will include, for instance, the highest levels of various courses that are offered at your high school. So often it'll include a list of the AP or IB courses that your school offers. That way, that college isn't penalizing you for not taking AP Calculus BC if your high school doesn't offer AP Calculus BC. At that point, it's not your fault if you didn't take it, of course. Uh, on that piece of paper is also the average SAT and ACT score from your high school. And colleges can see that and compare you with peers of a similar background. So that's important to note as well. The When it comes to standardized testing policies, so parents, if your sophomore is your oldest student, this would be brand new to you. And I would say parents who have had, students who are juniors now, seniors now, in college, there have been developments in this realm every single year since the pandemic. It was the case that almost every college required test scores. COVID hit. I think every college went optional at that point. Some went test blind, meaning they don't use scores at all. But the vast majority went test optional. And nowadays, what we see is we have essentially probably about 80% of colleges are test optional in some way. And when I say test optional in some way, what I mean is, next slide, please, these middle three policies. So test optional is an umbrella term. It exists on a spectrum where test optional just means they'll accept your application fee and process your application, whether or not it includes a test score. They don't tell you anything about your likelihood of success when they say we're test optional. And so test optional kind of falls into these three categories. Some colleges are test optional, but it's basically required with rare exceptions. One of my favorite examples here used to be Ohio State. Ohio State came out this year and started telling the truth and went back to requiring test scores, which is nice. Before that, by the way, 85% of their accepted students had submitted test scores. How many of those 15% do you think weren't athletes? Not too hard to, surmise. Then you have colleges that are test preferred. And I would say most test optional colleges I would put in this bucket, where essentially they would rather see what they consider a strong test score. And that's going to vary from one school to the next, what strong test score means. But they would rather see what they consider a strong test score, and they're going to, prefer applicants who can submit that. And then you have colleges that are what I call truly test optional, meaning they believe they can do an equally good job of evaluating students with or without the test score. And they just want you to send it, if you think it will help you, and not if you think it won't. The best proxy for understanding if a college is what I call truly test optional here would be if they were test optional before it was cool, meaning before 2020. So, for example, Wake Forest was test optional before the pandemic hit. Bowdoin and many other small liberal arts schools were test optional before the pandemic hit. When you apply to these schools, you can see, okay, they committed to this before it was a fad, before it was convenient, right? Before everyone else did. They really believe in it. There are other schools too who went test optional in 2020 and are truly test optional. For example, Temple University, to use a local example to Philly, they admit about 30% of their students with scores, 70% without. So that's, by the way, information you can see in the common data set. But generally speaking, test optional exists on a spectrum. And so you can't always just take a school at their face value when they tell you, hey, we're test optional. And we're seeing a changing tide with test optional in how schools are reacting to grade inflation, frankly. So we have multiple reps from colleges talking about how standardized test scores are more effective than grades in predicting a student's ability to succeed on campus. This is especially true at some of the more selective schools in the country. And an economist from Brown said actually that the more competitive an applicant is, the more important a test score is. And that's because those excellent grades, when you look at applicants to, say, Ivy League schools, most of them are going to have absolutely excellent grades in academic rigor. And so the standardized test score exists as a way that they can separate applicants. This final quote from Emory is important because it was given in context of talking about their increased use of AP scores in admissions. They say they don't trust GPAs anymore, and they're looking for, to use Alyssa's term, external validation of your grades. It's awesome when you get an A in AP chemistry. If you get an A in AP chemistry and then a 2 on the AP exam, the college is left to assume, okay, that is a course that undergoes grade inflation, right? But if you get the A in AP chemistry and a 4 or 5 on that AP exam, you're able at that point to showcase to the college just how, successfully you learned that knowledge. And when we talk about APs, this is one of the big changes I've seen in my 10-year career in this space. When we first started, and Eric and I used to give these presentations back in the day in people's living rooms, um, we would tell people AP exams are brownie points on your application. It's a small thing that can work in your favor, but don't worry about them so much from an admissions standpoint. AP exams are awesome because you can get college credit or place out of certain requirements, right? So you could maybe skip right to Spanish 3 in college if you had AP Spanish, or you could even get credit for general education requirements so you don't have to. I was lucky enough to, when I entered the University of Pittsburgh, I entered as a sophomore and I was able to take classes very specific to my major immediately because of all the AP credits I had in high school. That was a huge advantage to me. It's also a great way to save money, by the way, because in college you pay per credit. You don't, well, depends on the school policy, but usually you don't have to pay for AP credits. APs, though, are having a growing importance in admissions. And this is especially true if you're a student who thinks you might be applying without an SAT or ACT score. Because when you don't have that SAT or ACT score, we're looking for, again, that external validation of your performance in high school. And if you can back up your grades by saying, yeah, I did get excellent scores on my AP exams, maybe the format of the SAT or ACT is not the best way for you to showcase your stuff. If you can showcase it on the AP exams, you'll do a lot to help yourself. And AP exams this year are May 5th to May 16th. As I mentioned earlier, just make sure you're honest with yourself now about how much work you need to do. I get a lot of calls the week before the AP exam to set up tutoring. We can try, but our AP tutors are going to be very busy by then. And there's honestly not that much good we can do the week before the exam compared to students who start like a month out. So the bottom line with test optional is this. A strong test score is unequivocally, another SAT word, still an admissions asset. So a strong score will help you almost anywhere you apply to college, unless you're applying in Cal State or the University of California system. The more selective your college goals are, the more important having that score becomes. Because as the research shows, the scores are more important for stronger applicants. And you want every single possible factor you can get in your favor when you're applying to those schools.
And I just want to add on to that point, Jim, there's two sub bullet points to that I think that are important and timely. One is the role of AI, which I think we're going to be mentioning in other capacities, during tonight. But, you already alluded to that of the universities and colleges that went test optional, once the pandemic was subsiding and there were in-person tests again and access to testing was re-expanded, even a lot of the universities and colleges that stayed test optional, number one, didn't want to, but they retained the policies anyways for the time being. And number two, they weren't practicing it like Ohio State, right? There was very, very limited data released. And of the data that we found, overwhelmingly, the universities were overwhelmingly um, preferring students who submitted test scores that were in or above the range, right? And I think that's key, right? Everyone looks at these inflated numbers from the past 5 years, this test optional era, And they go, well, we don't have that, right? We're a little lower. We're in the middle of the range. It's like, no, no, they still wanted you to submit scores at that point, in that range. And I think that there's a number of forces that are allowing colleges, even in the past few weeks, we've seen this. It seems like every week there's more schools going back to test required. I think people are going to look at this as a immediate in the moment thing. Really, I think that there's forces that are finally giving permission or necessitating this return the test required. AI is a big one, and we get asked this all the time since the start of 2025. And, look, AI is going to only exacerbate the grade inflation, Jim, that you spoke about earlier. The tests are something that they're going to desperately value. And in this case, I think it's important that we acknowledge it's not just SATs and ACTs, but also AP exams. And I was just on the phone with someone earlier today who was talking about how their student who's at the University of Michigan went and read their application file. And APs were evaluated there in the context of their grades, and they were seen as contextualizing and important. I think we're going to see a real resurgence in the standardized testing. But the one other thing I want to add, Jim, that, you know, I think Alyssa and I have been answering a lot more, when working with essay students and application students is, well, what's going to happen when things go back to test required? Are all of a sudden the average SAT and ACT scores going to go down, right? And obviously, we can all speculate one way or the other. And maybe people start Googling data from, like you were saying, like before test optional was cool to see, what's going to happen. But I think that since we can't predict, right, it does emphasize what you just said here, right? The more selective your goals are, like you just want as strong of a score as possible, right? And I know you're going to talk about scholarships in a second, but like for us, I think that's always been the value and philosophy is you study for the test and you do test prep with us not necessarily for a specific score, but to get the highest score as possible so that it opens as many doors as possible and you can be more of the chooser than the choosy. But I mean, the merit scholarships is an important point. I know you're about to make it.
Yeah, so of course, more options is kind of the primary reason that you would want a stronger standardized test score, as Eric said. But it's important to note that there are colleges out there. I'll shout out the University of Alabama here, where they have on their website a table that shows you for your GPA and your standardized test score exactly how many thousands of dollars a year they'll give you in merit aid, in scholarships. And when I say, that they're giving scholarships for test scores, I don't mean for 1600s. They have a scholarship more than $1,000 a year for a 1200 on the SAT. So these are attainable scholarships that many schools offer on the basis of standardized testing. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And even some colleges that are genuinely test optional, that I would call truly test optional in my earlier slide, they have some scholarships that they still require standardized testing for. So if merit scholarships are going to be an important part of your family's financial plan for college, then standardized testing becomes more important as well. The last point I do want to call out here is that if it's the case for your student personally, that the amount of time and effort and potentially money that they would need to spend to get that test score to the point where it's an asset for them is just not worth the trouble. If the juice isn't worth the squeeze, to use one of my favorite expressions that Alyssa likes to make fun of me for sometimes. If the juice isn't worth the squeeze, you don't have to squeeze it. Meaning, you know, test optional is a valid path, and there are a lot of great test optional schools out there. If your plan up front is not to test, not to prepare, and not to take it, you need to make that plan with both eyes open and understand the ways that you're limiting your options. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, there's a different right plan for every student, and for some students, that may be the plan. So let's talk about our options for standardized testing for the big tests. We've got the digital SAT. And so parents, if your students are older than juniors, if you had an older student older than a current senior rather, then you are not familiar with the digital SAT unless you've tuned into our webinars about it. But the digital SAT is essentially now just a version of the SAT taken on a computer. Structurally, you're going to have two sections, reading and writing and math, each with two modules, so four sections of testing total. And your scoring's out of 1600. Parents, most likely that's the way that you took it. It was out of 2400 for a brief moment in time. It's back to 1600. And relative to the ACT, the biggest challenges the digital SAT presents are the fact that there are limited annotation tools on the test. And what I mean by that is, when you take a test on paper, you can write anywhere you want on the paper. And there are a lot of standardized testing strategies that involve annotating the heck out of that test. When you take a test on a computer, you're limited to the tools that are built into the app, which are very useful and valuable, and we can coach students on how to make the most of them, but you're limited to what's offered. The verbal questions of the SAT tend to be more challenging than their ACT counterparts. And that's important to keep in mind if your student struggles with, for example, English from the 1800s, which features pretty prominently on the SAT. Poetry shows up on the SAT and not on the ACT. And finally, the SAT is adaptive. And here's a chart of what I mean by that. In each section, so this works the same in reading and writing and in math, you start with a module one that's a standard difficulty level. And depending on your performance in module one, you're kicked into an easier module two if you do worse, or a more difficult module two if you do better. And that's going to dictate where in the overall scoring curve out of 800 for that section that you can score into. Now, there is some overlap with how you could score, with a very high score in the lower level second module or a very low score in the higher level second module. So it's not an exactly clean, like, oh, if you get the easier second module, you're capped at this score. It's different on every test, and the weights of the questions are variable. So it's a little bit of a black box exactly where your score might end up. But the point is that students test into a second module based on their performance in the first, and that will dictate their potential score ranges. I mention this as a challenge, not because it's actually makes it more difficult to do better on the test, but rather because students get in their own heads about it quite a bit, and sometimes parents too. When this version of the test was first coming out and people were learning, oh, the SAT is adaptive now, what's your strategy for that? A lot of times in the test prep world, people expect us to have our magical strategy fairy dust that we can sprinkle on the test and make scores go up. It's not exactly how it works. But generally speaking, the thing I was hearing was, oh, well, maybe we could get a few questions wrong in the first module on purpose to get into the easier second module. And then maybe it would be easier to hit our goal score from the easier second module. Don't do that, please. Don't ever get questions wrong on purpose on the SAT. In general, if you think about it this way, before it was adaptive, when all the SAT cared about in terms of scoring was just how many questions did you get right in the overall math section, right? If you missed a bunch of questions in the first half of it, your score was capped. I mean, you can't get an 800 if you miss half the questions in the first half of the test. So this is not really any different than that. If you don't do that well in the first module, if you don't do that well in the first half of the test, it's kind of the same thing, right? I mean, you're still stuck at a lower score. So the truth is, what students should be doing is just trying to get every question that they can correct. And there's no kind of magical gaming to be done. But sometimes some students just kind of get stuck in their own head about it, and it makes it more difficult for them to focus on just the simple task at hand, which is do your math, do your reading and writing questions. So this brings us to the enhanced ACT, and this is ACT's terminology. Whether or not you consider it enhanced is kind of up to your own standards. But it's the new version of the ACT that is coming for all of you sophomores. So the new version of the ACT will be in full effect as of the September test date. So that's the first test date we typically recommend for most sophomores. More on timing of testing in a moment. But the enhanced ACT has 3 mandatory sections: English, math, and reading. So those 3 scores are scored out of 36. and averaged together for your composite score out of 36. The ACT also contains now two optional sections: a science section, which used to be mandatory. We recommend taking science, more on that in a moment, and an ACT writing section, which is scored out of 12. We recommend skipping that. No college uses it. West Point used to. They were the last holdout. Not even West Point uses it anymore. Don't sign up for it if you don't have to. If you take the ACT during the school day in a state where the ACT is a graduation requirement, you may be required to take the writing section. But if you're signing up of your own volition to take it on a Saturday for college admissions, skip the essay. Congratulations, you just saved 40 minutes of your life. So the biggest challenges on the ACT relative to the SAT are the fact that the ACT, the timing of the test is stricter than the SAT, more questions, less time. The enhanced ACT is actually alleviating that a little bit, but it's still going to be faster than the SAT. The format of the ACT is new-ish. What I mean by that is that 90+% of the content on the test is the same. And like a lot of the changes, for instance, are superficial. For example, they're adding question stems in the English section, where before they just gave you answer choices to pick which one's grammatically correct. Now they ask you which one's grammatically correct. Or in the math section, they're taking us from 5 answer choices to 4 answer choices, which of course has no impact on how students actually take the test. But it is a format difference, and there, are some things that are less familiar there. The other thing is the confusion about whether or not the science section is actually optional, which I'll talk about on our next slide. So the big changes that we're seeing to the ACT, and I'm referencing this specifically for parents who had older students who took the legacy ACT, the version that has been for decades. The ACT will now have a digital option. What that means is you can choose to sign up for a digital ACT or a paper ACT. We recommend signing up for a paper ACT. The reason is pretty simple. When the SAT redesigned for a digital test, they redesigned their whole test to make it make sense on a screen. The ACT's digital option for the ACT is just a paper ACT with glass in front of it. It's just, it's not formatted specifically for the digital medium. And so, for example, in the reading and science section, when students are working from longer passages, they have to scroll up and down a lot. Whereas when you take the test on paper, you're going to have double pages in a test booklet. One side's your passage, one side's your questions, and you just have to scan with your eyes. You do not have to flip pages or the digital version scroll up and down. And so that actually does have an impact on students' timing on the test. And with the scrolling, it takes longer. So there's an advantage to testing on paper with the ACT. So we recommend doing that. The science section of the ACT is now optional. I have 2 examples. Not many colleges or organizations have declared their policy on this optional ACT science section. I say it that way because ACT doesn't decide if science is optional, colleges do, right? So the ACT science section is required for the Bright Futures Scholarship. If you're in Florida, you know what this is. It's a massive state scholarship program for Florida that is based on grades and test scores. It is the biggest scholarship program in the country that has announced their policy for this, which is why I have it on the slide, even for those who aren't from Florida. Stanford, though, they're the sort of biggest name school that has announced their policy. They say science is optional for us. You can submit it or not. This is sort of the same bifurcation, another SAT word, that we saw in the test optional period, where it's optional for admissions, not optional for scholarships. So we'll see if that kind of holds up as more colleges announce their policies. But for now, we recommend, again, in the interest of keeping your options open, take the science section of the ACT. It also tends to be one of the sections where students improve the most, at least according to our data. So it's a good opportunity to help yourself. Finally, the ACT is going to be shorter than it was, with more time per question. So that's important as well. Now, in terms of which tests to take, the answer is you should try an SAT and try an ACT and compare those scores. The idea being, if you just score way better on one test or the other, then you should prepare for and focus on that stronger test. If your scores are closer together, then we kind of look through things with a more fine-toothed comb and make a determination based on sort of where we see more room for improvement. So ACT diagnostics are in transition. And what I mean by that is that ACT hasn't released an official practice test in the new ACT format yet. So the important thing to note with ACT in transition is that we're waiting on this new diagnostic test from ACT. Once we have it, we're going to send it to families. And we're coming up with a solution for if we don't have a diagnostic in the new version by 2 weeks from now. So, in other words, the week of April 7th, you will all receive an email from me with the diagnostic test to take for the new ACT in whatever format we're able to do it in. We're going to look through your results with a fine tooth comb and help you make a determination for if SAT or ACT is a better fit based on that. Now, when do we actually take the SAT or ACT? So, the the way we want to do this is basically to first think about when your math course load is at the right spot. What I mean by that is you want to have finished Algebra 2 and Geometry by the time you're taking the SAT or ACT officially, or at least almost have finished it. So if your Algebra 2 or Geometry course, or the equivalent in an integrated math curriculum, is finished by the end of 10th grade, then you want to take the test as early as possible junior year. And the reason is you'd rather have this off your plate in the first half of junior year than have to take it in the second half of junior year, which is one of the most academically busy times of high school. If you're taking Algebra 2 and or Geometry during 11th grade or the equivalent course in an integrated math curriculum, then you want to test for the first time in the spring of junior year because you want to learn that material in the classroom and then have it reinforced by a tutor. You don't want to pay a private tutor to teach you things that you're going to learn in the course of your school year in a few months. It's not an efficient way for you to spend your time or your family's money. We want to make sure that we're being efficient, getting those increased college options with an expenditure of time and money that makes sense for families, right? So again, we recommend testing earlier if you've got that math done, later in junior year if you're still working on that math during junior year. So the way we help with this diagnostic testing, which we'll share with all attendees here, like I said, we're waiting on the diagnostic in the new ACT format, but we're going to have an answer for you by the week of April 7th. So stay tuned for that. In terms of how we work with students, we meet students where they are. We target all of our test prep to be one-on-one tutoring, and we focus only on areas where students are actually missing questions on practice tests and assignments. And we do that because essentially not every student needs help with everything that's on the test. You might be great at systems of two equations, but you need help with graphing circles in the coordinate plane. Just a random example that came to mind. But the point is, you want to make sure you're spending time on the areas that you need to focus on and not on the areas that you're not. Our students are always completing practice in between their sessions to reinforce what they learned from their previous session and to give the tutor updated intel on what to focus on in the next session. And then parents, you're receiving an update from the tutor after each session with what was covered. And of course, you have me at the office and our team here to talk about the kind of big picture plan, and your student has their tutor working with them on that actual course material.
And I think, just one more point on the diagnostic tests. This has been a pillar of our company philosophy since the day it started because I'm really personally passionate about this. I grew up in Connecticut where back in the day, I think I can say at this point, it was all SAT. That was the only test that anyone focused on. No one ever spoke about the ACT. And I took a PSAT and some practice SATs, and I did fine, but my score was far lower than what my grades were. And then an admissions officer was the one who said, "Have you ever heard of the ACT?" I hadn't. And she said, Eric, every college looks at the SAT and ACT exactly the same. You just need to find out the one that's best for you. I took a practice ACT, that week. Lo and behold, I scored the equivalent of like more than 200 points better than I ever had on a practice SAT. The moral of the story is not that your student will score better on the ACT, but before you expend any time, energy, money, or stress on this process with testing, figure out what test is right for your student. Right, Jim? I mean, most students score in the range about the same. But if you strongly prefer one or the other, that's invaluable information at the
That's
onset.
right. And especially when you think about it from the student perspective, any students who are tuning in, you're the one that has to do the work, right? So if you much prefer answering SAT questions to ACT questions, that's important as well.
Yeah, for sure. So now that we've gotten all the quantitative stuff out of the way, now we get to spend the rest of tonight talking about the qualitative stuff, which I really am personally passionate about speaking about extracurricular activities and their importance in this process. Um, you know, one thing I alluded to AI earlier, and I just want to say, kicking off this conversation, I think we're really in the next couple of years going to see a renewed, not even a renewed, but I think we're going to see, a lot of deeper conversations about the importance of activities, especially in relation to AI. Because if we look at these five factors, AI can have a role in some of them, but it certainly cannot live your life for you, right? Like what you do after school, in the evenings, during summers, in your free time, like you are the one with agency. You are the one choosing what you do in your life. And colleges really want to see that you are doing things with your free time with purpose, meaning, depth, joy, intention, excitement. This is what separates applicants. So, when Jim alluded to me saying that, the grades are like the most important and least important at the same time, it's because when you're applying to, one of the top school tier schools in the country, and not even, right? Like top 100, all the students essentially are going to have the same range of grades and test scores. So, of the factors that are in your control, what can distinguish you, right? What can set you apart? And activities are the thing for 10th graders. Like, this is the moment, if you haven't already, to really have meaningful conversations. And I want to frame this conversation around this word ikigai. Now, ikigai is a word, a Japanese word that has no direct translation to the English language. But essentially, what it means is, ikigai is the intersection of what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you enjoy. Ikigai was in many ways the inspiration of a TEDx talk that I gave back in 2018 about what do we need to know about you, which is our essential brainstorming question Alyssa's going to allude to in a little bit. Um, it's also the root of this idea of better person, better applicant, that if you lead, in this journey of high school, if you are not living your life with this thought constantly echoing your head of what are colleges going to want? What do colleges want to see? If you stop that train of thought and you stop looking at other people and instead you focus on yourself and what's exciting and meaningful and important to you, what you're good at, what you enjoy, what the world needs, you find your ikigai, you will be a happier human being throughout this stressful high school journey and a better human being. And without ever once thinking about the word college, you will be a better college applicant. So this goes to the idea, Alyssa, of depth is more important than breadth, right? If you're taking what's truly important to you and you find ways to engage with it in myriad ways, that's the key. So the example I used in my TEDx talk is starting a band and how that, and you can look through this list. If you start a band in the garage, which some parents would lament and bemoan for, noise complaints, more SAT words, by the way, right? But, really what you're showcasing is creative talents, the ability to collaborate, the ability to take initiative, right? If you're writing your own music, I mean, intellectual and, not the traditional way, but I mean, you need to know music theory, you're essentially practicing poetry and creative writing. And then, look, again, leadership, curiosity, interest, but even the social justice, civic engagement, community orientedness, right? If you can go out and start playing, gigs around town and get paid, that's a job. But if you go start playing at charity events, that's volunteering, that's civic engagement. So really it's asking your student and talking as a family and saying what matters to you, what excites you, and how can we engage with it more deeply? Because at the end of the day, like that is what colleges want to see. And I think that there's so much frustration in this process at many, checkpoints along the way. Um, and people look at the admission system here skeptically, but I think one of the beauties of the American admission system, unlike many, many, many other countries, is that we are holistic. They are placing a value on, you as a human being and what you care about and what matters to you, and seeing the ways that you authentically engage in it. And to be honest, like it's not too late, right? When we are having these meetings, when we're having meetings, which I'll allude to in a little bit with ninth and 10th grade students, we oftentimes say ninth grade is the year to explore curiosities, right? 10th grade is the year to start saying, okay, here's what I love doing and what matters to me. Here's what I don't love doing. Let's get rid of that and stop doing it. I'm not obligated to do it just because I started it. And also saying, like, are there new things that I want to engage in? And I think that, it's important to say to students, it's not too late. If you've just discovered a new interest, there's still time. Even for very competitive majors like computer science, like one of my most successful students ever as a computer science applicant didn't even start coding until the beginning of junior year. And I really think that when he represented that story and shared his journey, colleges so hugely respected that and they saw his excitement and potential, and it paid off. So, um, you know, kind of rounding out this conversation, and what I'm alluding to here, if we can go to the next slide. Another one of, my favorite tag phrases when it comes to talking about activities is this idea that being, as the kids say, basic is easy these days. Being authentic is hard. And this makes no sense at surface level to many people, right? Like this idea of like, what do you mean? Being myself is difficult. Being myself is hard. Why? How is that possible? And it's because what happens is everyone starts high school, they go to the same clubs and activities fair, they're all talking with each other and exchanging the same ideas, and everyone starts doing similar parallel things. It's easy to go down paths that have already been blazed for you. It's much harder to take initiative, to design something new. And no, I'm not just saying start a club at school, right? You can start something outside of school. You can pursue research by emailing professors, by not just applying to a summer program. Um, the list goes on, but it does take self-discipline and initiative and drive to be authentic. And most of all, it takes self-reflection and having important conversations and pausing in this, all the pressure, and taking dinners and taking car rides and sitting down as a family and saying, like, what matters to you, right? What's going to make you happy? How can we engage in that? And that's something, if we can go to the next slide, just to kind of round out this conversation, that's something that we want to help students do and families do. We want to change the way that families are talking about activities, which is, again, it's imperative for college, but we also feel strongly it's imperative, for students and families too. So we have personal advising meetings, essentially, 1 hour college counseling meetings. Families meet with us, as they want. Generally, it's about once a semester, whether it's ninth or 10th grade, there's still time to meet this spring if you want, especially if your student doesn't have a plan for summer or is struggling with, hey, what am I going to do junior year? Do I drop these activities? Do I quit this sport? How do I add in something new? We want to have a conversation about this. We talk about other things too, course selection, a test prep plan, really any and all questions that you have, but activities are oftentimes the most fun focal point of the meeting. And I do those meetings. Karan, my co-founder, does those meetings, and so does Alyssa Coltrane, who's going to talk about building your college list, which, you know, I think for a lot of sophomores, they're just starting to think about this, Alyssa. And there's no imminent or immediate pressure, but I think the way you're going to calibrate the conversation is so invaluable.
All right. So when it comes to talking about the college list, once again, this is one of those components where it is okay to just start to think about this, but starting to have conversations and think about how this works can be crucial because there are literally over 4,000 degree granting institutions in the United States. If you eliminate the two-year colleges, that still only gets you down to 2,000, and the Common App is only going to let you apply to 20, and even applying to that many is a terrible idea. So, you have to limit your list somehow. And part of that is thinking beyond necessarily just the academic. There are absolutely moments where you can, if you know you want to be a pilot or study marine biology, call us. We have your college list put together for you already. But for many students, an academic program isn't necessarily going to be the ultimate defining factor of their college list. It may be those superficial elements. Do you want a big school or a small school? Do you want to be in warm weather or cold weather? Do you need to be in a city or a town? Because those components allow you to find a college that is not just going to be a school and a place for you to take courses for the next 4 years, but also a place that is your home. And one of the ways that we start encouraging students to have those sort of moments of self-reflection is by asking them to consider elements of fit. And generally, this is going to be in four major categories: social fit, physical fit, financial fit, and academic fit. I'm going to start off by just briefly alluding to the most important and the least pleasant to talk about, and that is financial fit. Have a conversation about what you can afford for college. Have that conversation early and transparently. Take a look at net price calculators on school websites and go into the list with a clear sense of it, because some of the hardest conversations that we have are when students fall in love with a school that is ultimately not tenable for their family's finances. There are great schools at every price point. Have that conversation first and foremost, so then you can get into honestly kind of the fun part of picking a college list. Asking those sorts of questions, those social questions. Does it matter to me if there are a lot of people in fraternities or sororities? Is that something that I want? Is that something that I explicitly don't want? Does it matter to me that the school has spirit? Do I want to spend my Saturdays? You can tell I went to a school that did not have a lot of spirit because I am struggling to remember when college football is. Does being able to tailgate
It's
matter
Saturday.
to Saturdays? Excellent.
Nailed it.
Yes. Um, does that matter to me? Some of that is going to be physical. Do I want to be in a big school or a small school? Do you visit the University of Pittsburgh and go, this is huge, and it's in a big, terrifying city, and maybe a small liberal arts college is more for me? Do you visit the small liberal arts college and go, this feels like my high school, and I'm claustrophobic? get me out of here? All of these components matter, as well as that academic component. Does it have the course offerings, the co-op program, the interdisciplinary or flexible curriculum that I want to have an experience that is worth it for me? As we go into building this list, we're going to want to have schools that are both reaches, targets, and likelies. And before I get too far into this, I'm going to hand it back to our quantitative man here. Jim, do you want to take us through what these terms mean?
Sure. So when we talk about percentile distributions at schools, you're typically going to see you saw, for instance, on our slide in the University of Pittsburgh that they break down the percentage of students in different GPA ranges. And you'll see in standardized test scores that they'll show you the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile test scores. And for most students, they consider the goal for a given college to be between that 25th and 75th percentile score. Now, the picture is a little fuzzier when it comes to the test optional world. For instance, if we look at the median score, 50th percentile, of a college where 50% of students submit test scores, if 50% of students submit test scores, typically that's going to be the higher 50% of all of the applicants. In other words, if that college asked all students to submit test scores, the 50% they received would be the top 50% of those test scores. That means when you look at the median score for a college where 50% of students submit scores, what you're really seeing is a 75th percentile, right? The median of the top half. So that's important to keep in mind because, as Eric alluded to earlier, you might submit a score that is below that 25th percentile at a school where fewer students submit test scores. Because if, say, 20% of students submit test scores to a school, then that means that the bottom 80% of scores are missing. So the median is really at that point, the 90th percentile test score. So I say this because the percentile ranges aren't quite as descriptive as they were in the past when all students submitted their scores and it was just a complete and perfect sample size of data. Instead, we have to consider submission percentages while we do this. So your score range is not going to be a perfect predictor of your likelihood of being admitted to a school. As we mentioned earlier, it's one factor among many, but it can work in these initial conversations as a nice proxy for sorting schools into reach, target, and likely tiers.
So when it comes to that breakdown of categories, reach schools, targets, and likely schools, you'll often hear people sort of in the same breath as defining those terms talk about the importance of the balanced list. You want to have 3 reaches, you want to have 3 target schools, you're going to want to have 3 likelies. We tend to take a slightly different approach. And part of the reason why we do that, and I'll talk more about this later on, is we really want to make sure that a student is choosing their likelies thoughtfully. Regardless of the number of schools on your list, you should have 2 to 3 likely schools that are thoughtfully chosen, that are great options, that a student would be happy going to. And then the composition of the rest of a student's list is ultimately up to them. Now, if a student wants to apply to a reach-heavy list and they're willing to put in the work and do the essays, because often the more highly selective a college, the more likely it's going to have 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 Columbia essays that it's asking the student to fill out. But if a student is willing to put in the work, apply to as many reaches as you'd like, but be prepared for the reality of what those low acceptance rates mean. Be prepared to hear no a lot more often than you hear yes, as long as you have those 2 to 3, maybe even 4 likely schools that you'd be sincerely happy going to, because the reachier your list, the more likely we are headed to one of those likely schools. We also want to encourage you to think about not just the number of schools, but the amount of work required to apply to them. I had a student that I worked with this past year who applied to 17 schools and wrote one supplemental essay. We've had students who apply to 10 schools and end up writing 20. So in many ways, the length of the list can be determined by the amount of work that is required to get into it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and that's something, if you're ever wondering, Alyssa and I have sadly memorized every single school's essays and the number of them, as she joked about Columbia along the way.
Mhm.
So, you don't hesitate to reach out to us anytime. We're even quicker than Google on this one front, if nothing else. So, um, determining reaches, targets, or unlikelies, it is more of a science than an art. The one big takeaway on this slide is if you want someone or something in the universe to tell you what your quote unquote odds are at a given school, there's no better source. Don't call us, don't call anyone else. Go to your school's Naviance or Squire or Score or C Alpha, whichever your school subscribes to. And they will oftentimes have scattergrams that show how students at your high school have done in the past. You know, you can see where you are on the scattergram of grades versus test scores and who is accepted, who is deferred, who is waitlisted, who is denied. That's going to be the best metric. Look at that, whenever you're going through this process. Also, it's worth noting that, you know, anything with an acceptance rate below 15%, Alyssa, Jim, and I don't care if you have perfect or essentially perfect test scores or grades and all that stuff, like it's a reach. That level of universities brags all the time about how many valedictorians and perfect SATs and ACTs they deny year to year, right? So there's reaches, and then we are not joking. There's actually an industry term now that we don't use a lot, but there's likelies, targets, reaches, and then they're calling them lottery schools, which again sounds snarky, but people are using this as a formal term now. Um, and I mean, look, at that point, you can say like single digits, especially if you can only need to count on one hand to get to that percentage. Be honest with yourself, not hopeful when you're building a list. Um, and, you know, the reason we say so much that it's a science and not an art is, let's acknowledge, like, come full circle here as we're closing this out and getting to the essays and Q&A. We've said that there's things in your control, and there still are that can impact admissions, like your selection of major. There's some majors that are called quote unquote impacted majors, hashtag computer science, that are very competitive, and you need to indicate that major to study in that program. They're just more competitive because there's so few spots and so many applicants. Things like demonstrated interest are also in your control, and this can influence the odds. Now, most universities do not value demonstrated interest, but our team spent hours and hours compiling an unbelievable list of which schools do and which schools do not. This is something you can check, for yourself as well on the common data set. But demonstrated interest means not just visiting campus or going to that university's info session if they're in town. It literally means subscribing to their emails and social media and then engaging with those posts. There are seriously, systems now that can track if you've opened the email and if you clicked on the links in it and engaged with the email. We had a student a couple years ago who really wanted Case Western and then unsubscribed. It was a school that very much values demonstrated interest, and unsubscribed from their emails. It was like, what message did you just send to that school? So be mindful of that. Even those little gestures can get noticed. Um, then of course there's early decision too, but I think, it's important to acknowledge the forces that are beyond your control. In-state policies, we literally on this webinar used to have a slide as an example of when we were doing like case studies of reach, target, and likely schools. University of Wisconsin was one of those schools. Well, what did University of Wisconsin, not just Madison, but the entire system do this year? Well, the state passed a law that's very protectionist of Wisconsin residents, Wisconsin students. If you are top 5% in a Wisconsin high school, you are automatically admitted to University of Wisconsin-Madison, their flagship campus. If you are top 10%, you are guaranteed onto at least one University of Wisconsin campus. Presumably, a lot of them still got into Madison if they applied. This, of course, impacts out-of-state admissions, right? So when you're Googling average SATs and ACTs and talking to your neighbor and your friend and your relative whose kid got into Wisconsin 3 years ago, that's not the reality now anymore, right? Things change year to year. Now, oftentimes not that dramatically, but it's important to know. And we're going to be presenting a state of admissions webinar in April. We already did an early state of admissions, which if you check out our YouTube page, was, a really insightful webinar last month. But so much of the story is not the macro, but the micro. Also, the most invisible and frustrating influence is institutional priorities. Jim alluded to this earlier. It's like literally, does the university need a bassoonist that year? That alone could influence, a decision, but it also could go against you, right? If the university doesn't need the bassoonist, right? Maybe that all of a sudden becomes a detriment versus an asset, whereas most schools, it would presumably be an asset because it's such a niche instrument. And those are invisible forces that change. We'll never know them. You're never going to know them. It's frustrating, but it's not worth, wasting time or energy or stress over as you build your list. We oftentimes say that, when it comes to building your list, um, so many people, students and families look out into the world, right? But the best thing you can do is start by looking within and what matters to you and what you value. And that's why 10th grade is such a great time to be thinking about this. Um, because, you can start to think about, what do I want, in a school that's not just going to be my school for the next 4 years, but my home. So, Alyssa, do you want to take us home with likely schools and then mention essays?
Yes, and this is one of my favorite things to talk about because I, like Jim, ended up going to our likely schools, and not be over, in fact, some of the reach and target schools on our list. So, just to give us a brief reminder, a likely school is going to be a school where your GPA, class rank, test scores are at or above the 75th percentile of accepted students, and the school's acceptance rate is over 15%. You could be ultra valedictorian with a 1700 on your SAT, and you're still not going to have, Harvard as a likely school. And we asked students to have at least 2 to 3 of these schools where they would be truly happy, that meet all 4 components of that fit that we started off the college list section by talking about: financial, academic, social, physical. Because these schools are not only a great way to sort of reduce anxiety and pressure in this process, especially if you're applying to a likely school that maybe has rolling admission. Having that first acceptance to a school you'd be happy going to can take a lot of stress off of this process. But it means a lot when your quote unquote worst option is a really good one. And one of the things to bear in mind, and it was actually why I chose my likely school, is that honors college and merit money can really change the conversation. I have my bachelor's degree from Dickinson College, which was a likely school for me, but because financial fit was something that was really important for me and my parents, we had that transparent conversation. Then they went, what we have aside will cover in-state tuition at a public university. I went, what if I can make this private school cost the same as in-state tuition at a public university? And that meant that I was able to go to a school that really fit my criteria. I wanted something small. I wanted a more intimate setting. I didn't want to be in like big Happy Valley town, Penn State. So it was thoughtfully choosing my likely schools let me end up somewhere where I was going to thrive and succeed and do what I needed to do. But Jim, you went the total opposite direction than I did with your likely school, right?
That's right. Yeah. So my two big criteria when I was making my college list were that I wanted to be in a city and I wanted one of the top philosophy programs in the country. And so the two schools that I ended up debating between were Pitt and NYU. A big factor was the scholarship. Pitt gave me a great scholarship. That was excellent. NYU gave me a scholarship. Even with NYU's biggest scholarship, it wouldn't have been as cheap as Pitt without a scholarship. So the financial part kind of made itself. The honors college at Pitt, though, was one of my big deciding factors. The summer after my sophomore year, I was able to design and execute my own research with a faculty supervisor who then ended up writing one of my recommendations from graduate school. So the attention that you can get, from professors, the advantages you can get from the honors colleges at public schools can sometimes rival what you would get from a much more expensive private school. And you're often going to find these by applying to your likely schools.
And we're going to wrap up the college list conversation and bring us to our last factor, which, I personally think we have saved the best for last, also because I once again get to tell you, you don't have to worry about this yet. So, eventually, students will have to write at least one, if not more, essays as part of their college application. That being said, the trick for this part of the process is about finding a balance between getting those applications done and, living a life that is rich and fulfilling where you can get all of those other priorities done, where you can do your diagnostics and prep for and take the SAT and ACT and start to develop extracurriculars that are meaningful and thoughtful to you. And when the time comes, start getting work done on the essays early. We start meeting with students as soon as November of their junior year, starting with essays early so you can take on this process gradually without adding too much additional stress to this process, setting students up to success so that they can take full advantage of the summer after junior year, before senior year. And the reason why we recommend this is our our goal when we work with students and our advice to anyone on essays and applications, even if they choose not to work with us, is to aim to get the vast majority, if not all, of this writing done before the student goes back to school senior year. Junior year grades are important, but so are senior year grades. Any regular decision school is going to see the first half of senior year. Any early action or early decision school that defers a student is going to see the first half of junior year. Those grades are still incredibly important. And the last thing any student wants to hear is me or one of our other fabulous essay coaches going, so you're also signed up for AP College essay writing this fall. So start early, pace yourself, get this done before senior year. And the way that we help students with that is we start with them from the very beginning, from talking from that big open brainstorm where we ask students to lay out all of the things that matter to them, all the way through unlimited meetings on and drafts on every written portion of the application, but also getting on the, not the phone, because we know teenagers hate phone calls, but getting on Zoom and talking about senior year course selection, talking about those recommendation letters and who to ask, and whether it's okay to ask the AP Chem teacher who gave you a B, but also keeping students on track, setting deadlines, following up, so that all of this process gets done well in advance and no one has to stress or sweat or argue that part of the process. The one thing we don't do, of course, is we don't write the essays for students because it does need to be their voice and their work. This is one of the few places where students get to speak directly to an admissions officer in their own voice with their own words. So we keep students on track, we shape, we coach, we guide, but ultimately it's really to let their voice shine through. That is really it for essays. Go and enjoy and don't worry about that. But we do have a couple of takeaways to focus on before the end of sophomore year.
Yeah, so, in a brief summary, it's now the end of March. What can we do between now and May or June, whenever your school year ends, wherever you and your student are? Focus on grades. Number one most important thing. Finish sophomore year strong and ride that momentum into junior year. Make a plan for the SAT and ACT. What's the testing plan? What's the time frame? What's the schedule? Jim is here to talk with you and set up that meeting. We really believe in having that conversation and getting to know students and saying what makes the most sense. When do I take diagnostics? How do I evaluate these? What's the plan? Really reflect on and explore your extracurricular interests. Now's the time to take, real stock and a moment to reflect. Do I like what I'm doing? Am I happy? Am I doing things with depth and meaning and joy? You know, if I am doing that last thing, great. How can I build on that? Oftentimes when I'm meeting with students, they're enthusiastic and I say, that's great. You are living a great life. Can you live an awesome life? Can you be even a happier human being than you are? And I think that's a cool way of looking at it and positive as opposed to negative, this idea that students feel like they can never do enough. Like, let's put that in a positive light. And consider visiting some local schools, right? Start to explore, start to, imagine yourself and think about, hey, what do I like? What do I value? What do I not? Um, so that wraps things up for us tonight. Although with that said, we are happy to stick around and do some Q&A. So if you have a question, don't hesitate to put it in the chat. I know we've been answering some questions along the way as well. Do not hesitate to reach out to us anytime. We are here for your student and your family. This really is the perfect time. The end of sophomore year is the perfect time to have a conversation with us. There are so many, forks in the road ahead, and it's better to plan ahead. It's better to have these conversations now, in the moment. It's going to alleviate stress. It's going to take away any mysteries. We'll be able to debunk myths and set you up on the best path as possible. So please, whether it's, personal advising, a conversation about a test prep plan, now's the time to contact us. With that said,
Yes.
we'll stick around. There's one question. There's two questions we didn't answer in the Q&A. One is, do you believe unweighted GPA is more important than weighted? For example, all B's in the highest rigor versus all A's with moderate rigor. Jim or Alyssa, you guys want to take this one?
Sure. So the whether or not the weighted or GPA or unweighted GPA is more important to a college, they tell you that. Colleges will tell you we use a weighted GPA, we use an unweighted GPA. However, it's a little bit of a distinction without a difference because all colleges are considering grades in the context of the rigor of your courses. In other words, whether colleges want it numerically as a weighted GPA or an unweighted GPA, it it's not actually a difference in the fact that they care about the level of the courses and your performance in them. So the other thing I'll mention just more directly, you said, is it better to have all B's in the highest rigor or all A's with moderate rigor? We talked to a University of Pennsylvania admissions officer about this once, and he told us get all A's in the highest rigor. Of course, that's the answer if you want to be admitted to one of the most selective schools in the country. Again, the answer is balance. So, no, it's not good to get straight B's. No, it's not good to get straight A's in a coursework that doesn't actually challenge you in any way. You have to find the middle. Both of those extremes are going to be bad in different ways. And, just saying, oh, should I always do this or always do that is kind of abdicating responsibility for your actual journey here. Think about where can I push myself? And rather than just, should I always do this or always do that?
And that is, I think, one of the things I would like to add on there is it is always going to be contextual. I don't think anyone here would be surprised to go, there are students who are stronger in certain topics or certain disciplines for than another, where maybe you aren't taking AP absolutely everything, especially if you are in a situation where the amount of work that that would require to even keep up in all of those classes is going to drag you down to the point where we're at all B's. But maybe you're a student who's really interested in STEM fields. So maybe we're thinking about, honors or regular level English and history, but we're challenging ourselves with an AP Chem class. And then, we have all A's and an admissions officer sees you challenging yourself for something that interests you. Or, the opposite direction where we're taking AP Lit and AP Psych, maybe, and reaching and challenging yourselves. Where ultimately what a college is looking for is for a student who is going to challenge themselves as much as they can and still be able to step up and answer that challenge without floundering. And that's a question for the student and the family to define exactly what that level is.
And just building off of that, when we're talking about rigor, someone asked if my school has a lot of APs and IBs, International Baccalaureate, what path is considered more rigorous? Um, Jim, do you want to take this one or do you have thoughts on
Sure.
that?
Yeah. So I would say one to one, an IB course and an AB course, or a IB and AP course, are going to be roughly considered the same rigor. However, if you complete the IB diploma program, that would be considered a more rigorous curriculum than a curriculum that included as the same number of AP courses as the IB diploma has IB courses. And that's because it's an international standard that, colleges just can really compare. American schools and international schools abroad follow often an IB program. It's something that colleges know well. So if you're doing the full IB diploma, that's going to be considered more rigorous than equivalent AP courses, but one to one, each class on its own, roughly similar.
And then I would love to close out the night with the last question. Is there really a target school anymore with admit rates dropping so much at so many schools? And I think this, in so many ways, captures like the nuances of the conversation tonight and like what we've been talking about. So, it's really easy. And I personally made this joke many times that target schools are kind of like a critically endangered species these days. Um, that it feels like the jump from reach to likely, it's just, and there's like nothing in between. Um, Everything feels insurmountable or really easy. Um, in a lot of people's minds. And, I think that's a vast oversimplification, by the way, of it. Um, in the traditional sense that I think we've grown to think about Target, yeah, Target's have gone by the wayside. The biggest culprit of this, by the way, is this idea of yield. That colleges are obsessed with yield, meaning they want to take the fewest, they want to accept the fewest number of students so that they look as competitive as possible, right? And that's why there's so many colleges, especially the medium-sized private ones that were traditionally what most people saw as the targets. And now Northeastern has a quote unquote 7% acceptance rate because they're essentially playing Moneyball with students and manipulating numbers and statistics. And, we see that reflected at other universities as well. I do want to say this though, just to, reassure families and make sure they feel like they have the agency and know that they have the agency they do. Because I think perspective is everything as well. Um, what is a target school, right? And I'm going to use, you know, say this more emotionally than, you know, with precise statistics. But if you think what's the difference between a reach and a likely, right? A reach is a school that you're not really betting on getting into, but you have a shot. A likely is that you probably are getting into, but there's a shot you may not, right? That's why you apply to more than likely school. Targets are in the middle, guys, right? Like targets mean there's a shot you're going to get in. There's also a shot you're not going to get in. And it could go both ways for any number of reasons. And I think we've lost that. I think people for a long time saw targets as more of a 75-25. Honestly, maybe even more of like an 80-20 odds. And that's not what targets ever were. That's what they became in people's minds at some point along the way. But if we look at a traditional definition of what should a target be, targets are closer to 60-40 or 50-50, probably. Not going to say 40-60. That even for me, that's too negative. Um, but something more in that range where, I think there's targets that exist out there. Still, I think people are applying to targets that they may not realize are targets or be treating in their mind as targets. So I'll say that. Um,
And I want to add on just by sort of, I think, speak to the little bit of the anxiety and the frustration that I sensed behind that question, because I think often for families who are invested in this process, who go, but our student has challenged themselves, has done well in their classes, has pursued their extracurriculars, it can feel disheartening to go, but all of our targets are reaches and all of our reaches and targets. And I do want to say you should still be incredibly proud of all of the work that you have put in to get to this point. That is a not insubstantial amount of effort, and you have done everything right. And regardless of what your college acceptances end up being, that's something you should be exceptionally proud of. And we hear you on that.
think we kind of ended on that. That was beautifully and eloquently stated. So, thank you to everyone who's here. We will be sending a recording of this out to families. Please feel free. We encourage you to share this link with anyone you feel would benefit from this conversation. And, I want to add, especially we've been reflecting a lot on 15 years. We have grown really in two ways. One, by doing free educational events like this, as Jim alluded to, in the living room, but also in this, in the community and also in this setting on webinars. We love educating students and families and empowering them throughout this journey. But the other way we grow is by you guys spreading the word to other people. It means everything to us. We are a word of mouth driven business. So your support is everything. Please pass this on, make text and email connections. We look forward to supporting anyone you send our way. And of course, we look forward to continuing to supporting your students and families in this journey. So thank you for giving, part of your Wednesday evening to us. And we look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.